Thank you, Rav, and thank you everyone for joining. My name is Amanda Adams. I'm one of the co-executive directors at BC Policy Solutions. For those that might be new, we are an independent research institute that acts as a fearless progressive voice for everyday people. Through solid research, community engagement, and bold ideas, we work to advance economic, social, and racial justice and equity to drive meaningful change towards a more just, resilient, and sustainable society. We work right here in BC alongside with local people and community groups to shape the debate on economic and social policy and expand what's politically possible, speaking truth to power, building common cause, and turning shared values into lasting action. And today we're here to provide an analysis on the BC budget that came out on Tuesday. We've got a great panel here with my colleagues Iglika and Veronique from our team at BC Policy Solutions, and we're incredibly grateful and excited to be joined by our friend Sven Biggs from Stand.earth. Now, they have spent hours scouring this budget, so you don't have to, and they will be presenting their findings and what it means for the people of BC with what was and what wasn't in this budget. Following their presentation, I will be asking them some of your questions, as Rav mentioned. So be sure to pop those into the Q&A feature in Zoom. Please try not to use the chat so they don't get lost. And we will get to as many of those answers as we can before our time together runs out. And on that note, let's get to it. I'm going to pass it off to my colleague and co-executive director, Iglika, to start us off by giving us a summary of the budget. Iglika, over to you.
Thank you, Amanda, for this introduction. Let me share my slides. One second. Thank you all for coming. Wow, we figured out the technical. Sorry, guys. One second. All right. So as Amanda said, my name is Iglika Ivanova. I am a co-executive director and a senior economist here with BC Policy Solutions. And together with my colleague Veronique, we were at the budget lockup on Tuesday, making sense of the budget. So over the next 10 or so minutes, I will talk a bit about the major focus of the budget, which was containing the increase in deficits and debt, and how this leaves people in BC to fight for themselves, essentially, without any additional support to strengthen strained public services, to close rural-urban gaps in access, and to provide any relief from the high cost of living and increasing cost of food and rent that many, many families and individuals in BC are struggling with. So before we go into what was in the budget, let's talk a little bit about the context in which the budget was tabled. So yes, we do. I'm sure you have read in the news, we have a deficit and we have growing debt, but we also have ER closures and long wait times to access healthcare. We have an increasing number of patients being treated in the hallways because there's no hospital beds available. We have strained public services. We have rural communities where there is no adequate access to healthcare, to education, to social services. We have a deep affordability crisis, with wages not keeping up with the high cost of living, and food prices have started to climb up again quite a bit faster than inflation at the end of 2025. We have an ongoing housing crisis, and homelessness in Metro Vancouver increased by 9% over the last 2 years. We have 1 out of 8 people in BC living below the poverty line. We have high youth unemployment, and we have wildfire and flood management costs that are now a permanent drain on the budget. So in that context, what did the budget deliver? As you all know, budgets are about choices. The budget is the most important document that the provincial government puts forward every year. And in it, they spell out their priorities, both verbally and in dollar values. So we see verbally the priorities that the BC government would like you to know about are that this is, their words, not an austerity budget, they are safeguarding public services, that they are securing BC's future. But let's see whether they're actually doing those things. What they are doing is really prioritizing slowing down the increases in deficit and debt. And they're doing this with these five measures, big measures. So we are going to see 15,000 public sector jobs cut over the next 3 years. It is not clear exactly where these cuts are going to come from. The BC government has said it'll be focused on management and administrative non-unionized positions, which have really increased over the last few years. But, it remains to be seen where the actual cuts are going to happen. We also have, in addition to those public sector cuts, 3.5 billion over the next 3 years in unspecified expenditure management. And the government is also calling it a realignment of service delivery. This is concerning, and we're going to watch closely what happens because this might well mean longer wait times to access disability assistance, longer wait times to access, labor protections, environmental protections, and all these other services that the government provides. There's also modest tax increases, which is something that we were happy to see. We have been calling for tax reform for a long time now, but I will talk a little bit more about it later on in the presentation. The fourth way in which government is delaying the increase in debt is delays to infrastructure projects. I won't have time to go in detail over the infrastructure budget in this presentation, but if you are interested, ask me a question in the Q&A and we can talk more about it. But some projects are being delayed in order to avoid taking on additional debt. And overall, we're seeing a slow retreat from public services. Many key service areas are seeing increases that barely keep up with increased caseload and is not actually going to cause any meaningful improvements to be able to be made, right? And we are not investing in making life more affordable or building a more equitable future for children and youth. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the deficit and debt, not because I think these are the most important pieces in the budget, but because this is what the media is focusing on and you'll be reading and hearing a lot about those. And I want to give you some analysis to help you understand better what is happening and to help you counter the corporate funded talking points that are making the rounds in media today and over this week. So what's happening with the deficit? The projection for the year that is about to end at the end of March is that the deficit would be 9.6 billion, which is down considerably from what was projected in the November in the second quarterly report, which is the latest projection we have before this budget. That 9.6 billion includes 4 billion contingencies. Some of that money is going to go to pay for increased wages for public servants, very important and necessary increases. Some of will pay for wildfire and flood management, but it's unclear whether all of it will be spent. Next year, we have $13.3 billion deficit table for 2026-27. That is an increase from what was last projected in the first quarterly report, but this increase is driven by the increase in the contingency amount from $4 billion to $5 billion. So the budget includes very, very significant contingencies. More than 1/3 of the budget deficit projected is in these contingencies. So it is quite likely that at the end of the year, we're going to be in a better fiscal position than what is projected today. Now, what about the debt? Yes, it's growing. It's growing from 26.1% to 30.6% of GDP. This is the relevant metric. The media and corporate voices really like to focus on the actual numbers, $143 billion. These sound like big numbers, but we have a large province that is wealthy, has a high GDP. So when we calculate the debt as a share of our economy or our ability to pay, we're at 30.6. And while increases are projected, we are still well below Ontario's debt to GDP ratio of 37.7% for the current year that's going to end in the end of March. And so although Ontario's is not increasing at the pace that our debt is increasing, it it's important to note that in perspective, our debt levels are not, excessive or much higher than many other provinces in Canada. An important question that I think we should be able to answer is, how did BC's deficit and debt get so big so fast? The I think this government is getting a bit of a rough ride with that question because there's a lot of external forces that drove the increase in deficits and debt that the government had no control over. These include the economic slowdown that was driven by US trade tensions and global geopolitical tensions. Our global economy is having to realign, trade partnerships that were considered, very secure, selling, goods and services to the US now is becoming much less so. And so the whole economy has to realign. This causes uncertainty, it causes slow growth, it increases demand on government services and supports. So of course, we're going to see higher deficit in this environment. And it's not going away tomorrow, as Mark Carney, a prime minister, said in his speech, we are going to be poorer for the long run, and it's going to take a while to dig ourselves out of this slowdown and economic slump. So we can expect that the role of government would be important and deficits would become a responsible way to go forward. Plus, of course, we are having much lower forestry revenues than we had in previous years because softwood lumber tariffs and because of low global lumber prices, plus the reduction in timber supply from wildfires, the pine beetle, climate change impacts. So less revenues, more demand on government. Of course, we also had the carbon tax elimination, which cost us $2 billion a year every year going forward and increasing, We are having to do an historic infrastructure build out to tackle a massive infrastructure deficit that was left by the previous government. That is why we're increasing capital spending so much and infrastructure spending so much so fast, because we're dealing with a deficit left from years of underinvestment and delaying projects, deferring projects. Of course, we also have higher interest rates, which are increasing the cost of debt quite apart from what the government is doing. And we have had to increase our operating spending to address 16 years of erosion and underfunding in public services. But with all that said, I think it's really important to remember that our spending as a share of GDP is still a little bit lower than it was before the BC Liberal government cuts of the early 2000s. And to drive this point home, I just want to show you this graph that shows BC's government total spending as a share of the economy. Yes, it has increased since 2017 when the NDP government came in power, but it has increased because it has been dealing with the erosion of services precipitated by the cuts in the previous 16 years. So we are catching up, we are making up for lost investments, and we're still spending, a little bit below what was spent as a share of the economy in the late 90s. So we don't have government spending higher than ever. And one thing I wanted to address specifically, because I've seen it a lot in the news and in the budget coverage, is what happened to the $6 billion surplus that was projected in November 2022? And how is it that this government inherited such a huge surplus and such good finances and, have they really squandered them? So one thing that people won't tell you about this big surplus that was projected in the second quarterly report in November 2022, is that it was an anomaly. It was not the state of public finances in perpetuity. It was just an anomaly driven by a bunch of one-time things. One-time windfall from higher than expected corporate and personal taxes from 2021. If you remember the post-pandemic year, there was a very, very big, fast economic recovery, faster than projected. So those government got taxes from the CRA for prior year tax adjustments. So, taxes from prior year. That was almost $4 billion. We also had a one-off boom in natural gas royalties, spike in natural gas prices globally due to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. caused gas royalties to be much higher. They are double what is projected for this year, 2026. Even though now we have LNG Canada, we didn't have LNG Canada, but we had very high gas prices, one off. We have stronger forestry revenues in that year. We got $1.4 billion in the forestry revenues, more than is projected for 2026. We had rock bottom interest rates up to the mid 2022, which kept borrowing costs very low. And we had double digit nominal GDP growth, which is how government revenues grow based on nominal GDP. So we had the highest recorded levels of GDP growth since the late 70s, 16.1% in 2021, 12.1% in 2022. If you recall, this high growth is why the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve in the United States engaged in a very steep interest rate hikes in order to slow down what they called an overheated economy. As a result, that slowed down government revenue growth. Today, nominal GDP is projected to be growing by 4.1%, so, 4 times lower than in 2021. And so you see why we don't have these surpluses today is we had a whole bunch of one-offs, record high prices, record high growth. And what this one-time budget surplus was invested in was more housing, healthcare improvements, and cost of living relief for families. You may remember that's when the renter's tax credit started. There was a one-off top up of the climate action tax credits and more BC family benefit increases. So, it was appropriately invested to help people deal with the cost of living crisis. What about the increase in interest cost? Yes, we are hearing a lot from the business sector that the debt servicing costs are the highest growing line item in the BC budget, and they are. But much of that is because BC is building new schools, new hospitals, new housing that will serve people for the next 20 years. So that needs to be paid for, and we're paying for it. We'll be paying for it over the next 20 years through increases in debt. And it is better than not having schools, hospitals, roads, housing, and all the rest of these important infrastructure projects that BC needs. We are addressing a massive infrastructure debt incurred by previous government. We are have a higher interest rate environment, so that is increasing the costs. But amid this deep economic uncertainty and high interest rate environment that is leading businesses to retreat and not invest, it is not appropriate for the government to also retreat. The government should be investing to take up the slack left by the private sector retreat. So quickly, there's a lot of new revenue measures in this budget. And I know I am running out of time, so we can discuss the revenue measures in more detail in the Q&A if people are interested. There's a lot of them on the personal income tax, PST, property taxes, speculation and vacancy tax, a lot of different things. In general, though, these measures don't go far enough. They're projected to only raise less than $1 billion this year, 2026-27. And so over the next 3-year period, we're going to be short almost $3 billion from revenues due to the carbon tax elimination. And when you add to that $2 billion that we lost in 25-26, then it tells you why we have to borrow more. We have to borrow more because we don't have these revenues. BC remains a low tax province, even with the new revenue measures. There is room to increase taxes on higher income earners and high-end property owners. There is room to review corporate tax credits and subsidies to ensure they actually are benefiting the public. And BC could definitely be getting more revenues from natural resources. Now, I did want to show you very quickly what's happened to revenue as a share of our economy. Even with the newly announced tax measures, we are looking at government revenues from taxes, fees, royalties, all the things that the BC government has control over, is at a 25-year low. We are at 25-year low for revenues this year, and this is costing us $18.7 billion a year in foregone revenues. So If we were collecting revenues at the same rate as we did before the big tax cuts of the early 2000s, we would not have a deficit because we would have $18.7 billion a year more. So just a food for thought. The deficit is caused by the government being unwilling to ask those who have more and wealthy corporations to pay more. In summary, budgets are about choices, and what this budget chooses is to prioritize lower increases to the deficit and debt at the expense of public investment. Public investment that could have improved affordability, public investment that could have strengthened services, which are stretched at the moment, and public investment that could have addressed large rural-urban gaps. I think we should remember that it is responsible to run large deficits when the economy is slow, so that we can invest in the hospitals, schools, childcare spaces, affordable housing, and healthcare we need, and that more ambitious revenue measures could have created the fiscal room for bigger critical investments. And with that, I will pass it on to my colleague Veronique to share a bit about the impact of the choices the government is making on people.
Thanks, Iglika. That is great context. So, as I present, maybe imagine what we could have been doing with that extra $18 billion. And can everyone see my screen? Okay. So you likely know the proverb, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. This is attributed to Ben Franklin talking about fire safety, actually, not health. It means it's easier, cheaper, and more efficient to prevent a problem than to fix it after. But unfortunately, with Budget 2026, instead of an ounce of prevention, we're seeing a budget term savings at the cost of long-term social and economic cost. So there's a second layer to this. You know, social services and supports aren't just costs that need to be managed. They're economic multipliers. When we invest in public services, that money doesn't disappear. It circulates. It puts more money in everyday people's pockets, which in turn gets spent in our local economies. You know, this means every dollar invested in public services acts as a multiplier, returning, you know, 2 to 3-fold in economic activity. So these pauses that we're seeing in the budget reduce spending, so-called discipline choices. Instead of preventing the expensive consequences of poverty and leveraging this multiplier effect of social spending, it's dampening our collective economic capacity and it's slowing potential growth. You know, as Iglika mentioned, this is exactly why we're in this position, still paying for these kind of decisions that were made in the early 2000s. So let's start with poverty measures. On paper, you know, the BC poverty rate has dropped nearly 30% since 2016, which is great, but it's not a victory. BC still has the highest poverty rate among seniors of all the provinces and the second highest overall poverty rate in Canada. 1 in 8 people in the province live below the poverty line. Nearly 150,000 of those are children. Food bank use has surged, you know, nearly 80% since 2019, including a shocking rise in food bank use among people who are employed. And in a province as wealthy as ours, this is both a moral failure and a very expensive policy failure. So Budget 2026 adds, you know, 120 million over 3 years for income, disability, and supplementary assistance. But to put this in perspective, last year they committed to 3 billion over 3 years, and that amount didn't really move the needle on poverty reduction. This is all just an attempt to keep up with the growing caseload, and the extra that we're seeing now is in part because of the removal of the spousal cap on disability assistance for couples, which is really great. But there's no increases to income and disability assistance rates. They continue to keep recipients below the poverty line. There hasn't been an increase since 2023. They're not indexed to inflation, you know, so if you think about since 2023, inflation has risen 4.8%. Groceries are up 6.8%. Rent is up 11.4%. You know, yet a single person on income assistance is expected to survive on about $1,000 a month. That's, you know, less than half of the poverty line. And we all pay for this. So we pay for poverty in higher healthcare costs, lower school success rates, lower productivity, higher rates of homelessness, which we treat as a crime. So, we have ballooning costs in policing and the court and carceral system, and the costs of all other supports that people in poverty need to rely on because they don't have the financial independence they need to make ends meet, which, by the way, if they had that money in their pocket, that all goes back to the local economy, to rents, to groceries, to our public utilities and transportations, right? It's not exactly just an expense. Now, a major contributing factor to poverty in BC is the cost of housing. 1 in 6 renters spends over 50% of their income on housing. More than 2/5 of senior renters live in unaffordable housing. 150,000 people in BC are in core housing need. But we've got no new increases to SAFER or the rental assistance program supplements. And of course, the high cost of housing is driven in no small part by a lack of supply. And yet, and I'm sure many were shocked by this, in the midst of an affordable housing shortage, budget 2026 cuts nearly 1.4 billion from housing development. They're reducing the already way too low projected community housing completion from 4,500 down to 2,500 homes per year. That widens the gap significantly against the estimated 25,000 new units annually that are truly necessary. There's no new investment in the community housing fund, no new investment for the Indigenous housing fund, no funding for the urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. And so the consequences of this is going to be felt immediately. And the consequences are racially uneven. They're gendered, they're going to affect children and seniors in poverty. This is a choice about who we privilege with the provincial levers and who we decide to abandon. And there's a big missed opportunity here because better housing policy is a lever for economic productivity. A big build out of housing would create good jobs. Low-rise builds would use BC lumber. Increasing the supply of affordable non-market housing lowers rents, prevents homelessness, improves health, and, higher density would reduce transportation costs, all of which increases disposable income that gets spent in local economies, increases government revenues. This could be really good for us. Now let's turn to healthcare, where, it looks like we saw a good increase in funding. In budget 2026, over the 3-year timeline, we have 2.8 billion in new funding, 2.3 for health system capacity, 131 million for mental health, and 34 million for the new IVF program. But I'm sorry to say that this is not only not enough, but I also think we're still not making the best use of our money here. And I should mention capital spending on healthcare has been reduced by pausing and pacing upgrades and new construction, particularly of long-term care facilities, which is a choice I don't understand because seniors and their caregivers, people with aging parents, they can't wait. You can't really pause aging. Then we know the province has been really focused on doctor pay almost to the exclusion of all other important roles that are required to ensure people have access to good health care. And I'm going to focus on primary care for a second because better access to primary care, it leads not only to lower death rates, fewer hospital admissions, fewer emergency room visits, lower healthcare costs overall, better preventative care, safer medication prescribing, and a better quality of life. And we know that the best way to deliver this good primary care is through community governed team-based models. This is where, a diversity of health and social support practitioners, team up and are better equipped to deal with complex needs than a physician working on their own. And it's more cost effective than the fee-for-service model. And we can look to Oregon here, which has already had a big transformation over the last 8 years towards not-for-profit team-based care. And they've found in these 8 years that there's been close to $12 in savings in other parts of the healthcare system for every dollar invested in primary care. These models can also integrate social services like housing and food security and legal aid, even connection to elders right alongside medical care. And they can offer mental health services that people can access early and quickly without barriers, which is much more cost effective than the one additional mental health and substance use investment in budget 2026 to the most expensive form of mental health care possible, as the Disability Alliance puts it, with a strong focus on the expansion of involuntary treatment. So this is not only, bad prevention practice, right, waiting for the crisis to become acute, but it's a criminalized approach to mental health, and it is not evidence-based. I just have this from Disability Alliance here, that budget 2026 may be considered one of the more austere budgets tabled in the past decade, despite it being not an austerity budget. Funding for childcare and K to 12 has mostly been stay the course. There is some good news here. There's 167 million investment in the Classroom Enhancement Fund. This is to hire more teachers in general, but also for spec ed teachers, teachers, psychologists, and counselors. There's 475 million for new supports for BC children and youth with support needs. This is great. It's going to provide some direct funding for about 12,000 families. Now, it is replacing a previous program for autism. So what's good about it is it broadens the umbrella, but the amount that families will receive has gone down from 22,000 a year to 17,000, or as little as 6,500. And it's not clear how high the significant need bar is to qualify for that higher amount. And to get the full 6,000 for the disability benefit, you have to have a household income of less than 50,000. So not easy to qualify for these. Budget 2026 also increases childcare funding by 330 million over the next 3 years, which is definitely much better than nothing, of course, but it's there to make sure that we don't lose the recent improvements to affordability that we've just gained. But, and this is a huge but, Budget 2026 pauses any expansion of the $10 a day program for at least a year, and let's hope no more than a year, because this is a huge missed opportunity. Universal affordable childcare is one of the most effective poverty reduction levers we have. It supports healthy child development. It allows parents and caregivers, especially women, to enter the workforce. The government is really proud of their skills training funding, which not only has no equity component to it, but as the YWCA notes, without expanding childcare spaces, many women and caregivers cannot take advantage of the training programs. So let's get into the post-secondary issue then. The post-secondary funding model in BC is broken. In the early 2000s, public funds covered nearly 70% of operating costs, and, student tuition the remainder, and that ratio has nearly been completely inverted. And it's pushed institutions to rely on exorbitant international tuition fees. And the 2024 and 2025 federal caps on student visas caused, this rather racist revenue model to collapse. So we've got 20 of BC's 25 public institutions projecting deficits. 180 nearly programs have been cut or suspended. Services are being cut and scaled back. We've got at least 1,000 staff and faculty that have been laid off. And Budget 2026 does absolutely nothing to address this crisis. There is the increase to the skills trade training, which is really great. Although I'd say 283 million in new funding over 3 years is really a drop in the bucket of what we need. So we are going to see more layoffs. We're going to see more lapsed contracts, the loss of good jobs, which is what we're supposed to be growing. We're going to see more program cuts, likely entire campuses closed, and these impacts are going to be particularly affecting rural campuses and communities. Now, I say this as a person, my dad's a carpenter and an electrician, a true craftsman, in a way that I think we've really lost over generations of undervaluing skilled trades. And I think it's very important to course correct that. I'm really on board for that. But this is a yes and situation, not an either or situation. There are also consequences to undervaluing humanities and social science degrees. And that's going to erode civic engagement. It's going to erode critical thinking. And these degrees are just as essential to a functioning economy as skilled trades. By letting our public institutions fail, we're deepening precarity for students right now, for people seeking to return to school to improve their career opportunities. We're discouraging global talent from choosing BC. We're pushing higher ed further out of reach for working class families, because I worry that this collapse is going to mean we're going to see a revision to that 2% annual cap on domestic student tuition increase, meaning only rich kids can go to college, and that's going to have generational effects. We're heading in the exact opposite direction of the world's best economies, which offer robust, often free post-secondary education. The benefits of investing in higher ed are clear. It strengthens the economy, it creates good jobs all across the province. Graduates get higher paying jobs, and subsequently, they can pay more in taxes. Everyone is spending more in their local economy. It drives innovation. So finally, I want to touch on the public sector itself. Iglika mentioned that drastic 3.5 billion cut from the public sector under the guise of, recalibrating program delivery. The claim that it's going to target managerial jobs, but I really remain skeptical of that. And regardless, why not redistribute this spending to improve capacity of the more critical roles? Really important agencies like the Employment Standards Branch are drowning in backlogs over a year in delays for people. And instead of funding the ESB to protect workers from wage theft, which is a big thing they do, the government is actually cutting some of its funding. This is going to keep a lot of workers in poverty, not only by denying them their due wages, but from the knock-on consequences of being in limbo for so long and precarity, maybe missing rent payments. And worse, I think there's a clear indication here that they plan to offload some managerial public service work, even decision making, onto AI systems, which is an investment in a speculative bubble, that transfers wealth from workers to corporate shareholders while eroding service quality. You can't protect workers or enforce standards with this kind of hollowed out public service run, not only by risky, but notoriously biased and error-prone systems. So once again, the costs of these supposed efficiencies are going to be borne elsewhere, not least of which in the drain on our resources that AI systems require. But I'll leave the environmental questions to Sven in a minute. I just want to wrap up by returning to this idea of prevention. There's a narrative that social spending is a drain on the economy, but the evidence tells us the opposite. Social services and supports are economic multipliers. And, the private sector can't function without a healthy, educated, and housed workforce that has access to good transit and affordable childcare. So I hope we're getting the picture here that our well-being as a province is contingent on the well-being of the most marginalized. This is why designing for equity is so economically beneficial, because it benefits us all. And when we leave the most marginalized behind, we're all going to suffer. And the evidence is really clear on this. Cutting supports and services for marginalized people does not help the middle class. Study after study shows that austerity creates permanent losses in GDP by undercutting human capital, by reducing money that flows to local economies. And so with Budget 2026, the government has chosen to let fires burn and let us all pay for the damages. So on that terrible climate apocalypse note, why don't I pass things over to Sven?
Thanks. Let me just share my slides here. Hopefully that's working and you can all see. I just want to thank the BC Policy Solutions for inviting me to be part of today's presentation. Stand.earth was founded 25 years ago here in British Columbia. The focus for most of the early years was protecting rainforest and old growth forest, some of it here in BC in places like the Great Bear Rainforest. I joined Stand about 12 years ago. Most of that time I spent fighting the Northern Gateway and Trans Mountain Pipeline. These days I am the Canadian Oil and Gas Campaign Director, and my team is fighting LNG, trying to reduce emissions from homes and buildings. And later this year, we'll be launching a campaign to phase out the export of thermal coal. I included this photo because it is a picture of the Bear Mountain Wind Farm near Dawson Creek. And I think it is a good reminder that other options and economic pathways are open to not just British Columbia, but this is the heart of the oil and gas patch to the region that is most impacted by our current economic model. And Iglika touched on this, but I don't think you can talk about the budget and climate change without talking about what happened with the carbon tax. Um, carbon tax brought in $2.6 billion in the last year that it was fully in effect here in British Columbia. Um, the NDP made a change when they came to power under the BC Liberals. The carbon tax was entirely offset by tax credits. The BC NDP started using some of this revenue to fund climate programs, and some of it went back into general revenue. So when they canceled this tax, all of the Clean BC programs that had been funded by the tax no longer had a source of income to support them. That meant that many of the incentives that were kind of the core programs of Clean BC had to be canceled overnight. Um, Effectively, this means that BC no longer has a coherent climate strategy. Um, I think a lot of critics of Clean BC would have said that it was too based on incentives, and without this funding, uh, we just don't have a plan to fight climate change. There are some attempts to save some of these programs, but I would say this is more like saving the furniture while the house burns than a solution to climate change. Um, I want to talk most of the time about LNG. This is my who or best slide. Um, when Christy Clark was elected in 2013, she promised, of course, to pay off BC's debt, create a sovereign wealth fund with the income from LNG. And her government approved over 20 LNG terminals up and down the coast, but none of those were built. And that was because her plan included taxes on LNG exports. So when the NDP was elected under John Horrigan, they wanted to prove that the BC NDP was pro-business and that they could build at least one of these terminals. They focused on phase one of LNG Canada, which of course came online Canada Day of last year. To get it built, they eliminated all the taxes that Christy Clark had proposed on LNG exports and promised to sell electricity to LNG terminals at the discounted industrial rate. Additionally, for phase one of LNG Canada, they put together a package of very generous tax breaks that included things like breaks on PST on construction costs, capping the carbon tax for this project, and other incentives, including hundreds of millions of dollars in cash for the project. They were successful in getting Shell and the other international oil companies that own LNG Canada to commit to building the first phase of the project. When David Eby came to power, their government has been struggling with high deficits and an uncertain economy. And I've heard from several ministers in his government that they just cannot say no to any economic growth. So as a result, they have kind of doubled down on this LNG strategy and are trying to hold it up as an example of how the NDP is growing the economy. So, based on that, you would think that there was a windfall of revenue from LNG projects coming into government. The main source of revenue from these projects is natural gas royalties. Sorry. According to this year's budget, BC will see just $942 million in royalty revenue from natural gas. To put that in context, that's just over 1% of the total revenue that the government is going to bring in this year. And it is less than that we're going to make either off the BC Lottery Corp or the BC Liquor Distribution Branch. So literally the lottery is a better bet for BC taxpayers than oil and gas at this moment. I guess you must be saying to yourself, surely as more of these LNG terminals come online, we will see more revenue and this plan will pay for itself. Unfortunately, the global reality doesn't line up with that. After that 1 year blip that Iglika talked about, the war in Ukraine drove up gas prices. a whole bunch of LNG projects rushed to market to meet that demand. And as a result, there is now a glut on the global market. This is also because places like China, India, Pakistan have moved more rapidly to solar and other renewable energies, and their demand for gas going forward is not as strong as had once been predicted. So there is a real risk that any new LNG terminals that come online here in British Columbia are going to have trouble finding a market for their product, especially since LNG produced in British Columbia has higher costs than some of our major competitors like Qatar or the United States because of the difficult geography and labor market in northern British Columbia, where most of these projects are proposed for. All right. Well, I think we can't talk about this without talking about some of the hidden subsidies that prop up the LNG market. The biggest one might be electricity, ironically. Here in BC, we have a low carbon grid. Over 97% of our electricity comes from low carbon sources. But LNG, especially electrified LNG, is very electricity hungry. The amount of electricity to power a project like the Slisms LNG terminal, which is proposed there north of Prince Rupert, uh, is not something that BC Hydro can currently supply, which means that new transmission lines will need to be built to these projects, and new generation capacity will have to be brought online. That will come at enormous cost to BC ratepayers, who will pay the brunt of those new costs. The North Coast transmission line, which is part of this budget that is announced, is a $6 billion project because the BC government has signed MOUs with these LNG projects to keep their electricity bills low. It means that those costs are going to end up either being paid by ratepayers or put added to BC Hydro's debt, which we will eventually pay through our hydro bills. Another way is the criminally low natural gas royalties that we pay that are charged here in BC. Our organization led a campaign to phase out some of the worst royalty regimes. We managed to almost double the royalties, but that means they went from about 2.5 cents on the dollar to about 5 cents on the dollar. And they're capped at that rate until wells begin to generate a profit for the company, and they've covered all their capital costs. This means that most wells we will never see significant revenue from. And the final hidden subsidy I want to highlight today is water. All the gas for LNG is supplied by fracking, which is incredibly water intensive. Last year, the oil and gas sector in British Columbia used about 9 billion liters of water. To put that in context, that's about the same demand as the residents of a city the size of Nanaimo. For access to that fresh water, the oil and gas industry paid just over $20,000. The BC government is considering making changes to those rates, but it is long overdue. And the Northeast, where most of that water is extracted from streams and rivers, is suffering from a multi-year drought, and farmers and communities are struggling to get enough water to water their crops and meet their drinking water needs. Um, I'm going to pause here and create some time for questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Iglika, Veronique, and Sven. There was a lot of information there, and we didn't even get to everything that was included in this budget. We do have quite a few questions in the chat. I know we're getting close to time, but if you're able to stick around a little past one, we're happy to do so as well. My first question that I'm going to bring forward, this would be more for Iglika. A couple folks have been asked around kind of the changes to taxes. A little bit more information about kind of specifically what those changes to taxes are and what it means for British Columbians.
Yeah, happy to chat about taxes always. Let me see if I can pull up my slides where I had outlined them all so that I can show you what exactly happened with taxes. So the new revenue measures, there's quite a few, even though they don't raise a ton of revenue. But let's talk about the income tax rate for the bottom tax bracket, which got a lot of play in the media. And I think it is not very well understood by all. So what the government is doing is increasing the tax rate from 5.06% to 5.6%. And and that is an increase, but it is combined with a corresponding increase of what's called the BC tax reduction credit, which means that people who owe very little taxes, who have the lowest incomes, are not actually going to pay more. And so the government estimates that the lowest 40%, the people with the lowest 40% of income, so a big proportion, almost half of British Columbians who file taxes are not going to actually pay more as a result of this because of this tax credit increase. So the people who are going to pay more are the people in the second, third, and highest bracket, and they're not going to pay that much more. The maximum amount for this year was calculated at $201. And what my critique of this tax increase is that it shouldn't have just been the first bracket. It should have also been the second, third, fourth, and fifth bracket. If we increased all the tax bracket with this kind of 0.54 percentage point, we would have been collecting a lot more revenues than right now. So that's one thing. The government's also pausing inflation indexing of tax brackets and tax credits for 3 years, starting next year until 2030. So this will result in higher taxes being paid as people's income increase to keep up by inflation, or if your wage increases, you're going to now be in the next tax bracket potentially, even though your real purchasing power hasn't increased. That raises some money as well. It's been commonly used by other governments federally and in other provinces. It's something that you can do to increase taxes without saying you're increasing taxes. So, I think that's a good thing because we are a low tax province, and even with this change, we will continue to be a low tax province. There is also a PSD change, which is really interesting. The government is expanding the base of what's taxable under PSD to include some professional services like engineering services and to remove some exemptions on the landlines and basic cable. So this is going to generate about 500 million a year. It makes sense. It's modernizing the tax base. It doesn't make sense why if you are selling, nails and hammers, you have to charge PST, but if you're selling engineering services, you don't have to charge PST. As our economy becomes more service focused, we should be charging PST on those high margin professional services, and that's a good way to generate revenue to fund the things we want to see. We also have some tax increases focused on the high end of the property side, so properties valued between $3 and $4 million are getting a bit of a tax increase. Those valued above 4 million is a bit of a tax increase. We had recommended these increases. We actually recommended double those increases, but the government went halfway. So still good policy. There's more room. There's a room to create another bracket at $7 million of property value. We also had a small increase in the speculation and vacancy tax for foreign owners. And then we have some property tax rules, general residential and non-residential property tax increases through now the rates are not going to be based on inflation. They're going to be based on increase in nominal GDP, which is generally higher than inflation. So we're going to see some high property taxes to the extent that people who own property tend to be higher income. That is a progressive measure. The government's also repealing this northern and rural homeowner benefit, which was a top up on the homeowner tax credit. It was introduced to offset the impact of the carbon tax because, northern and rural homeowners would spend more on heating and pay more carbon tax. But, now that we don't have a carbon tax, they've repealed that. Um, there's also an increase in the interest rate for property tax deferment for seniors. So there's going to be now a higher interest rate charged, prime plus 2, that matches the interest rate more closely the interest rate the government's paying on those deferred revenues. Before, there was a big discount on the interest rate that deferring property tax resulted in. So this again is fair to other taxpayers because otherwise everyone else has to pay for the property tax deferment. And there's some business tax credits. So, there's a new investment and manufacturing and processing investment tax credit. So I think, the business should be happy because they are getting increased tax credit. Whether this generates more investment, that remains to be seen. But they did get some increases. So I think we should, keep that in mind when we talk about the overall tax system. So overall, I would say the tax increases were relatively progressive, but they weren't high enough. And we could have seen a lot more increases of income taxes for higher earning British Columbians, in the second, third, fourth, fifth bracket. One thing back to the carbon tax is that when the carbon tax was introduced, there was a cut to the bottom tax bracket, but there was also a cut to the second tax bracket. And so now we've increased the bottom tax bracket, but why not the second? There was also cuts to the small business tax rate, to the corporate tax rate, and some other things that also have not been reversed. So I think there's, room for more. There's room for more, and I hope to see more next year.
Thank you, Iglika. Sven, I'm going to go over to you now. Lots of questions about LNG, and I think largely your first slide summed it up. It seems like there's a lot that the government is betting on LNG as a revenue source. How realistic are these projected LNG revenues, and how does that compare to how much BC is actually spending on subsidizing LNG and kind of these sectors?
Yeah. I mean, we have looked at the natural resources revenues that have been projected over multiple budgets. Um, and there is this kind of reoccurring phenomenon where the provincial government predicts that next year will be a boom year for timber and oil and gas every single year. And they rarely meet their projected revenue. Um, they are really betting on these export terminals working. There's a couple key decisions that will be made this year about whether or not companies will even go ahead with construction. They're waiting on final investment decision. And they are really, I believe those companies are waiting for some side of incentive package or subsidy from either the federal or provincial government before they make those decisions. So we'll be watching for that closely. In terms of how large the fossil fuel subsidies are, a lot of the subsidies are in foregone revenue, and it's sometimes hard to predict exactly how much revenue we're missing out on in British Columbia. Um, the subsidies package for phase one of LNG Canada, I have seen several different projections, but it is probably in the billions of dollars based on those. We, for a number of years, did an analysis based on the budget to try to project what the fossil fuel subsidies in BC were. The last year we did that was 2024. At that point, we projected that they would be around 1.75 billion for that year. As a result of our work, the government changed the way they reported natural gas royalties in the budget, and it is now much harder to determine exactly how much revenue they're missing out on by keeping royal gas the royalties low, because they moved from a system where they gave out credits to offset royalties to just capping the royalties at a low rate.
Thank you, Sven. Um, I am skipping over a couple questions. Veronique has let me know that there is a fire alarm in her building and it has been going off for quite a while, so she has stepped out, but we will try to keep answering your questions. Um, and if you could stay with us a little longer, we'll keep going a little longer here. Um, I think, Iglika, this one might be back to you. Obviously, the government has talked about in this budget core provincial staffing cuts. You mentioned the 15,000 positions being cut. That seems like a large number. Can you speak to a little bit of where we might see kind of the real world implications, service impacts of those cuts? Where would they be coming from?
Yeah, it's really hard to say before we see what happens. I mean, the government has increased the public service, so there's different ways that they report how big the public service is. It does include, in the broader ways, and in what they mean is like all of schools and employees of schools and hospitals and, universities, colleges that are public. And so it's a lot of people who are actually providing services and now also a lot of administration in various levels. They've specifically targeted health authorities before for their administration. I know the BCGEU has campaigned a lot on the fact that there's been a lot of managers of a lot of new non-union workers hired in the recent years. And so I think that's the response to their successful campaign. The provincial government is looking to rein it in. But that there aren't exactly targets yet. It's one of those things where there's not enough information and we won't know until we see at the end of the day where the budget cut or the staffing cuts come from.
Thank you. Something to keep an eye on and watch for sure. One of the things that is obviously of interest with this budget is spending on mental health. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to what is in the budget related to mental health supports. And I've also had a request for addiction services.
Yeah, unfortunately, there is very little in this budget on these important issues, and I think the government is kicking itself because of the Tumbleridge tragedy, which highlighted the need for mental health supports, but they didn't have anything in there. So what's in the budget is a very small number. It's 131 million. That is for what they call the most intensive, and high, high risk or high service demand, addictions and mental health treatment. So, you need to have a crisis. It needs to be like, terrible before this funding would kick in, and it's mostly for funding involuntary treatment. It is, as Veronique had said, and other allies have pointed out, the most expensive way, to provide service at the very end of the crisis. When the crisis has occurred, there is nothing in investment. We know there's huge gaps in mental health services and support for youth, for everyone really, but especially for youth. And in previous years, there were some budgets that were trying to, put some more money into that system and try to provide some more service, but there's nothing in this budget. And unfortunately, the previous increases that we've seen have not been enough to meet the needs of some of our most vulnerable, residents here in BC. And so there is unfortunately nothing here on mental health.
Thank you. Yeah, disappointing to see, especially in light of recent events. Um, Switching gears just quickly, looking at transportation infrastructure, and some of the things that have been delayed. What kinds of transportation infrastructure spending may have been delayed? Thinking about how this might shift spending away from highway expansion, investing in public transit, a lot of these things that would be helping to reduce, obviously, climate impacts.
Yeah, we didn't see any delays in this budget on previously improved transportation infrastructure. The projects that they named being delayed are the 7 long-term care facilities, which now have no projected date for completion. It's, TBD in the budget. They're also delaying the Burnaby Hospital and Cancer Care Center expansion. and they are delaying a UVic student housing project. And as I wrote here in my comment to the question, the student housing may be, a smart decision to delay because we've had a huge drop in international students and maybe a little bit less pressure on student housing on campus. But long-term care facilities, when we have an aging population, that one doesn't make sense. I would have thought that they could delay some highway expansion projects. They did not delay any, of the ones that they have approved. What they chose to delay is healthcare spending. The SkyTrain expansions are proceeding. All the transit, the projects that they had approved already, those are proceeding. And I think the costs are increasing on some of those, and they are managing that by delaying healthcare spending.
All right. Folks are starting to drop off a little bit. I'm going to do one more question. Sven, I'm going to pass to you. Very broad question. But obviously, climate change still being a big concern, province and federally, provincially trying to meet climate targets. Ultimately, what does Budget 2026 signal about the BC government's approach to climate this year?
Well, I mean, I don't know if everybody approaches budget documents this way, but the first thing I did when the budget came out is I went to the speech and did a search for the words environment and climate. They're not mentioned, they weren't mentioned once by the finance minister in her speech to the legislature. I checked for LNG and it showed up 5 times. And I think that shows kind of where the priority for this government, as I said, at this point, I think Clean BC is effectively no longer functional. There isn't a plan to develop a replacement at this time. So I think people who are concerned about climate should be demanding that this government come up with a coherent strategy to address and meet our targets.
Thank you, Sven. A huge thank you, Sven, Iglika, and Veronique, for sharing your expertise. We have gone over time today. I know I didn't get to all of the questions. If you still have questions, of course, contact us. Our research team is still digging into a lot of this budget, and we want to know what's important to you. Thank you all for spending your lunch hour with us today. I do want to highlight that coming up on Wednesday, March 4th, we have the second session of our primary care series that may be of interest to some of you as well. So check that out on our events page. And if you like what you heard today and you like this type of analysis and thinking, please consider donating to support BC Policy Solutions so that we can continue to do this work and create opportunities for dialogue such as this. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.